Welcome to the Faith and Works podcast, sponsored by the InterFaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. I am Bob Bruttell, and I will be your host for today's program. Our podcast series has recently been exploring what is sacred in our world today. At this unsettling or unsettled moment, what do we consider sacred or hold sacred personally for ourselves or in society? Where do we find those sacred places and spaces, those sacred experiences that hold special value and that enrich our lives in ways that we call sacred? Today's program is titled Surveillance and Sacrality. I have two distinguished panelists with me today. They are Dr. Saeed Khan, Associate Professor of Learning in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies. He is Director of Global Studies at Wayne State University. Also, Dr. Chris Gilliard. He is a professor at Macomb Community College, where he teaches creative writing and literature. His research and scholarship concentrates on digital privacy, surveillance, and the intersection of race, class, and technology. Both of these professors have become well-known public intellectuals in their respective fields. I am elated to have them joining me today. And I am Bob Bruttell, as I said earlier, and I'm an adjunct professor of religious studies and social ethics at the University of Detroit Mercy, and the vice chairman of the InterFaith Leadership Council that sponsors these podcasts. So welcome, gentlemen. I think that it probably is going to go very quickly once we get started, but where should we start on the subject of surveillance and sacrality? I want to ask Chris to get us started, because this is a primary area of his research. Chris, what prompted you to start looking into the idea of surveillance and its dangers, essentially?
Well, thanks for having me, first off. One of the parts of my origin story that I always talk about is growing up in Detroit and growing up in the specter of the police vice unit called Stress. So people familiar with Detroit will know that Stress stood for Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. And the statistic I cite, it was a vice unit, and part of that was kind of undercover and surveillance work in an attempt to sort of entice people into crimes. And in the short time that it was functional, and I use the term loosely, in the short term that it was functional, the unit, I believe, killed 23 people, 21 of whom were Black. And that was right around the time I was born, or shortly before I was born. And so that kind of colors, no pun intended, a lot of the ways I've always thought about surveillance, about policing, about what the function of policing was. And that has stuck with me for my whole life. And as surveillance methods have become more prevalent, more affordable, more ubiquitous, I think a lot of the ways that these technologies are primarily serve a carceral function has been really supercharged. So that's the shortest version I can give of kind of how I got to some of the stuff I work on.
I think it's interesting that you would say that these technologies serve a carceral function, that they are ways of containing people, of criminalizing them in many cases. And I would think that idea of containment and incarceration has got to be somewhere on the opposite side of what we would call sacred, that it must be extremely hard for anyone who is being surveilled in that way and is in danger of being incarcerated as a result, or in danger of being limited in what their life expressions can be, has got to be on the opposite side of what we might call sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's originally what got us to this is you and I were on a text chain, and you mentioned the podcast, but you mentioned sacred, and you said, do you think that the sacred is possible with mass surveillance? And I said no. That was a sort of a knee-jerk response, but the more I've thought about it, the more I stick with I think my first reaction was the right one.
Yeah, and when I mentioned that to Saeed, and I really hadn't let it percolate much at that point, except that it was really clear that that was your reaction to the idea of whether or not you could be surveilled and have something we might call sacred. As I began to think about it, I really did sort of think out loud with Saeed, and so that was when I thought that we ought to get the three of us together. Saeed, remind me of what your reaction was when we first started talking about this subject.
Well, I think one of the first things that I thought about, Bob, was just the nature of religion itself, and being very mindful that for those who are devout, surveillance is baked into the theological cake, so to speak. The very idea, and you see this particularly in what we would call the Abrahamic faiths, a deity that or a God that is engaged. Some might even say intrusive into the believer's day-to-day life. There is a verse in the Quran that says that God is closer to you than your jugular vein. This, of course, is to connote omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence. But at that point, you feel your neck and you're thinking, wow, okay, from a spiritual standpoint, God is always in the room, so to speak. We, as then a believer in a particular faith tradition, aren't necessarily bothered by that surveillance. There are those, of course, who either don't mind transgressing, engaging in transgression, or are perhaps worried that they have been spotted. That is actually a notion of what's called God consciousness. Again, from the Arabic, that's called taqwa. The recognition, the acknowledgement that God is always present as a way to keep one in line or in check. And as a result of it, that kind of surveillance with the sacred is generally not considered to be problematic. And again, this is within sort of the Abrahamic traditions, as opposed to, say, the Aristotelian model of God, or the God being the prime mover, the celestial watchmaker, creating creation and then setting it in motion. If you want to borrow from Seinfeld, leaving on a high note, and having creation then deal with everything from that point on. Well, then that doesn't really require surveillance, but it really changes then the notion of sacrality in a very profound way. But I think when we were having our conversation, I wanted to make sure that we then distinguished, why is it that surveillance from a religious standpoint is seen as, by and large, by the believers, to be acceptable, but then surveillance outside that is seen as being highly problematic, by and large. And the difference, of course, is then human surveillance of other human beings, whether that is from the state or whether it is corporations with metadata and cookies and all of the other ways that tracking is conducted. How that then impinges not only on our daily lives, but also on our sense of the sacred. I mean, after all, religion is not only sacred, but synonymous with what we would then consider to be that very core element of ourselves, what we consider private. And in fact, this is one reason why the private space is sometimes considered synonymous with being the sacred space. And today we live in an era where it's hard to even be able to properly identify or define what is the private space. It used to be the home. Everyone used to say that one's home is one's sanctum, it's one's sanctuary. And yet with technology now, whether it is something that is imposed from outside or whether it is something that we have a certain amount of complicity in doing, it's hard to then say that the front door is as protective, creates that sanctuary, that sacred space that it may have maybe even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. That then is really intriguing for me, both from the standpoint of spirituality and faith, but then also in terms of how does it affect social dynamics? How does it affect our role as citizens? And then, of course, yes, how does it affect our role as believers in faith traditions when what we would consider sacred becomes subject to or even a target of surveillance? These are very weighty issues, and I know before we went on the air, we were talking about this idea about how much do we voluntarily give up, and is that even asking the right question? And particularly also when it comes to perhaps on a generational level, are older generations looking at this issue in a different way than younger generations? What then is sacred to them? What is their relationship with surveillance? Do they know? Do they care? These are some pretty weighty issues as well, and some very weighty questions as well.
Well, it occurred to me during that discussion where I tried to expand on Chris's idea that you couldn't be sacred while being surveilled, that in terms of a sense of a God or a higher power or some basis for spirituality, we do think that we're giving permission in some way to a merciful or a benign presence that's looking over us. We may even call that presence a loving presence, but we give it permission to look after us in a certain way because we believe that it's good for us in some way. And we probably even imagine, though I'm not sure that we would have a really complete idea of it in most cases, we probably imagine that merciful God, that merciful presence, wants the best for us, and that we understand its the proposition of that. We understand what is expected of us in some detail. What Chris is looking into and is pointing out to us is that we have none of that in terms of the surveillance that we have been, again, something that we were talking about a little bit before we started to record, that we've been coerced into giving permission for because we want to use the various technologies that are available to us and really necessary to us in our lives today. Have I got that right, Chris? Is that where you started looking at this in terms of its limitations and its the legitimate fears that it ought to present to us?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, so I'll try to give a pithy response if possible, or at least concise. But I do think that the idea of consent really needs to be foregrounded. A lot of what Saeed said when talking about a God or higher power, if I understand it correctly, had to do with the individual giving themselves over. And so if you bring in the idea of consent, like in the way as I define surveillance, I'm not even sure I would call it that anymore. But sort of the parallel, if we think about corporations or the government, abusive partners, things like that, most of those things, a key element in that surveillance is robbing people of consent. And so we might think about kind of terms and conditions and things like that we ostensibly agree to when we say that we can that will use a service, a social media platform, a website, some type of shopping online, things like that. And so often that kind of gets mistaken for or called consent. But what I think often gets ignored is the extent to which whatever data is gleaned from your interactions is not just used for that initial purpose, right? To identify you, to make sure it's you who's logging in and things like that. But it's repackaged, it's combined with other amounts of data, it's sold or, somehow rented to various corporations and, government entities, many of which certainly do not love you and do not have your best interests at heart. And so, but the other thing is that there's all kinds of ways that people never would imagine that this data is used. So a thing that's come out relatively recently is that any website you visit, and I do mean, I mean like 99% of the web has what's called like a Facebook tracking pixel. So even if you use a portal to access your health information, even if you are speaking with your therapist online, like all these things, all these ways that people certainly didn't consent to, and in many cases they don't know about, and in fact the business or the operator of the website doesn't even know about. But all of that information is being passed on to companies like Facebook and Instagram and Meta, Amazon, and so on. And so I think that idea of consent and to what extent you are willingly giving yourselves over to a power, I think is really essential when we have this discussion. And the ideas that sort of we've been given, the ideas about consent we've been given by tech companies and oligarchs is not one that I think really matches up with how people traditionally think about it.
And if it's secret, and if those who are doing it think that they need to keep it secret, that seems to that edges towards pernicious in that case. They know that they're doing something that if I was really clear on what I was allowing them to do, and I've got that word allow in some sort of quotation there, that if I was really aware of what they were doing, I'd say no. And I noticed that in Europe, where the European powers that be have given more tools to people to say no, they do say no more often than those online companies would like. So that we've got a more, I don't know, what would you call it, a more Wild West kind of an attitude going on in America, but probably need to go a lot further than they do even in Europe. But it's pernicious in the sense that if they know all of these things about us, and then if I mean, they claim to be benign, that they're just packaging information so that they can sell things to me. Whether you think that's benign or not is a good question. But when they're trying, but if others get a hold of that information and use it in some political sense to pigeonhole me, to limit my civil rights, to control me in some way, and we're only imagining that there's some sort of a firewall between those who claim to be benign and those who don't really care whether or not they're benign. They want to use it in some pernicious fashion. We're really in a rough place then, because our whole idea of what is sacred in our society is at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, I not to nitpick some with what you said, but if we look at the research of the companies themselves, right? Facebook's own research talks about the ill effects on the mental health of young people, particularly young girls, of spending too much time online. You know, Facebook's own research has noted the ways that Facebook's recommending engines recommend extremist content to people, you know, or create categories such as, you know, if you have interests of X, Y, and Z, you might also be interested in anti-Semitism, and recommend sites and create categories for people to ad target in those ways. Certainly not benign. And these are all examples that come from Facebook's own research, you know. And so I would, you know, I'll leave it to you and Saeed, who are far more religious experts than I would ever hope to be. But the contrast between giving yourself over to a loving power, and, you know, having information extracted from you by companies whose at best interest is to maximize their profits, but also, you know, contribute to government crackdown on people's civil rights, or in some cases, going much further in aiding authoritarian regimes, or, you know, contributing to genocide. And again, these are not speculative. Like these are things that have happened and continue to happen. And so I really think that as far as I understand what we're talking about when we talk about sacred, I think that schism is really important to highlight.
Saeed, as a Muslim, this has got to be something that you've given some thought to before today.
Well, I mean, I've, you know, kind of lived through the 9/11 era, but I think at the same time, I mean, you're also looking at least in this country's history, the way that surveillance was deployed against African American community, how it was deployed against those who were seen as dangerous to the state, potential enemies of the state, including pacifists. They were considered to be out of bounds because they were seen as nonconformists to what the state had in mind. And I think it comes to bear then that you mentioned before this idea of a benevolent God, higher power, loving, just. I mean, these are some of the adjectives that, of course, can be used in there. And for the believer, there is that presumption of goodness, of proper intent that is involved, and that, of course, is faith. That's the very core of faith. I remember in the movie Philadelphia, the late Jason Robards defines faith as belief in something for which there's no evidence, and I always liked that definition. Again, we can philosophize about whether there's actual evidence of God. Again, beyond the scope of this particular conversation that we're having here, but I think it's an important way to make the distinction between having faith in a deity and being nudged or coerced into having faith in the state and or corporations of having that similar proper intent. And that, I think, is highly problematic, that you already have the state which positions itself as being in loco parentis, you know, in place of your parent, looking after you, protecting you, defending you, ostensibly. And yet here we have it kicked up another notch, where with surveillance, the justification is that the state is no longer in loco parentis, but in loco deus. Have faith in us. We have a proper intent, perhaps all evidence to the contrary, but that seems to be the conceit by which it's operating. And so therefore, because you already signed up for this, because you're a citizen, you must go ahead and accept it. That's part of the whole idea. When you have an app, you have the terms of agreement, and everyone jumps to the bottom and hits accept because they just want to start using the app. in many ways, that is what is being relied upon, is that we, as I think Chris has said before, it's really not a matter of choice. I mean, or it's a false choice. Yeah, you can go ahead and not sign up, but you really do so at your peril of being ostracized, excluded in very real ways, not just sort of symbolically, but as being a functional member of society. You really don't have a choice but to go ahead and hit those click buttons. The other thing I thought that was interesting that Chris, that you mentioned, is how this surveillance is being sold after being collected in furtherance of or in complicity with authoritarian regimes. I think, unfortunately, it's gone even past that. It's now something that we see complicity with democratic regimes as well. I mean, I as you can tell, I'm a fan of pop culture, and I think of movies like The Post or All the President's Men. And centered around this is, of course, the idea of surveillance by the Nixon administration, of the Democratic National Committee, and all, with the Watergate scandal. But think about newspapers, journalists then, who are being threatened with their livelihood, and in some cases their lives, to give up their sources. That is a form of surveillance imposed. And you see the courage of people being able to resist that, defy that. And part of the reason that they can do so is, fortunately, the interpretation of our laws and our Constitution, and those who were in the position to interpret them at that time said that is against our values, it is against our Constitution and our laws. I'm not sure if that is a presumption we can have 50 years after Watergate, that whether our institutions to whom we cede so much power and authority will be then as benevolent as they claim to be, or is it going to then erode even further?
Well, it occurs to me as you're saying that the word manipulation comes to mind quite often, because once there is information about me, I'm reminded of opposition research that politicians do on their opponents. They look for information that can be twisted, that can be manipulated. And the more information that's out there, the more that information can be manipulated for nefarious purposes. And if we begin to have a sense that we're not a public person, I mean, at least when you offer yourself up for political office, at least you think of yourself as a political person, and you know that sort of thing, that opposition research is going to go on, and you're going to have to be prepared for it. And you might have to be a certain kind of personality that lets things run off your, like a duck's back, and be stoic about some of it. But it seems to me that most of us are not offering ourselves to be public and to have the information about us manipulated. And that's why it's so successful in a middle school where that kind of information is so dangerous to kids, right? That they can use it against one another and be manipulated in certain ways, because they're so vulnerable at that point. But I think we're all vulnerable. We think of ourselves as having some sort of a this is really going to date me, a Gardol shield around ourselves that somehow protects us from bad stuff. And I don't think that we have determined a way to do that yet, Chris. We have no protections yet. I know I read some things about your work where you talk about the fact that it's possible, and that we ought to believe it's possible. I thought your analogy about asbestos and something I read was really interesting, where you said that at one point, we didn't say we were against chemistry and that we couldn't change chemistry when we decided to find a way to eliminate asbestos in our lives. And I think that we could say the same thing about the PFAS that is of great concern to us right now. So where do we stand in terms of being able to protect ourselves in any way at all, Chris?
Well, oh gosh, it's not good. I mean, I go back to what Saeed said, and I'm very reluctant to even refer to us as a democratic regime at this point. Like I think that the erosion of our rights, coupled with the invasions of people's both outer and inner lives by technology, um, has left me not very optimistic about the direction we're going in. And I think to also build on what you said when you talk about manipulation, and one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to is how that question of manipulation is repackaged when we think about tech companies. So let's say, I mean, I assume that most people here either use Spotify or Netflix or both. Right? And one of the central ideas of surveillance capitalism and of many of these technologies is that with enough information on your likes, that they can then provide you with more things that you like. So if you listen to Spotify and given enough data, the claim of Spotify is that they can send you more music that you'll like. And in fact, sometimes even generate, use artificial intelligence, so-called artificial intelligence, to generate music that you like. And same with Netflix. So much so that the algorithm now will show people different artwork for the same show based on how they've interpreted your likes and dislikes. But they don't call this manipulation. Right? They call this recommendation. Right? The guise or the claim is that it's giving you what you want. And in fact, often they claim that the end game is to give you what you want before you even know it. And so if we I laugh because just to say it out loud sounds absurd, but if we translate this into our political arenas, that this is often not thought about or referred to as manipulation, but it's in providing people, it's talked about in terms of providing people with the kinds of information or material that they want in order to get them, to most directly sort of like feed right into their brain. I think I mean, I don't like these things at all anyway. Like I don't use Spotify and many of those other systems. But I think the effects, right, the ramifications for systems like that are negligible, probably. But when we start to talk about how that works in terms of democracy, then I think it gets to be really dangerous. And I mean, to kind of put a bow on it, I hope. I mean, there's very little. So there's no meaningful federal legislation that protects us from any of this stuff. And there's certain things in some states like California and Illinois. But I think part of the protections that we need would require a government that was more invested in the will and the benefit of the people, but also it would require people to understand a lot of these kind of Byzantine like practices that are very much hidden inside black boxes often.
I want to take that point, if I may, Chris. I mean, that just stunned me when you mentioned about Spotify and Netflix, and yes, this whole idea about the recommendations. So what we're talking about here is being predictive, and especially it struck a chord when you said before you might even know you want it. And from a theological standpoint, then what we're really looking at is moving from the predictive to predestination. And when you're moving to predestination, of course, then you have to really question what's on the other side of that coin, free will. So the more things become predestined, thanks to the predictive nature of surveillance, it then is going to have a negative impact on human free will, which is, of course, one of the things that makes us human. And I'm not sure if we really understand then, again, how the surveillance issue impacts the sacred. But I would say that that would be one way. The other thing, Bob, when you were mentioning the whole notion of being a public figure, I think we're moving closer to this reality that there are going to be fewer and fewer, quote unquote, private citizens left. If we start to gauge someone's public persona by the number of likes they have in social media, I think that there is a pretty cogent argument that can be made that this person is a public figure and therefore not given the deference of being a private individual. And this, of course, just one example, would impact defamation law. We saw recently with one of the many pieces of litigation that former President Donald Trump finds himself involved as a party, dealing with defamation. And of course, the argument was, as a public figure, the standard for defamation that the plaintiff has to prove is not just negligence in the statements that are made, but they have to prove actual malice. If, of course, then it is determined that the plaintiff, the person who is making the claim that they've been defamed, if you can prove that they in fact are not a private individual, that they in fact are a public figure, then it makes the plaintiff's case a whole lot more difficult to have to try to prove defamation. And I see that this is going to become a defense that is used more and more frequently. All someone has to say is, well, let's go ahead and say you've got 20,000 followers on Twitter. You've now reached a threshold of saying that you are a public figure. Maybe you're verified. Maybe your Twitter account or your Facebook account is monetized. That means that you have a certain presence out there. I think that creates a different kind of encroachment. The fact that now you are being redefined as an individual becomes even more pernicious. And just one more point regarding technology, that the whole idea about how much information people have on you, that you already are as an individual surveilled. I really wonder what artificial intelligence is going to then do. Is it going to be problematic in creating deep fakes where you now have to prove that you're not you? Or is it something that people will now create their own, thanks to artificial intelligence, masked persona that is different from the surveilled persona? Who knows where we're going with this?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry, Bob.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, Saeed, I just wanted to say that I think to backtrack a little bit, that point about prediction and predestination, I think is really like spot on. And that, again, when we think about what is sacred and what is the pathway to that, those ends, right? Prediction and predestination, I think, are so important when talking about this stuff. That's just such a great point.
Yeah, and where are you free? Where are you a free actor? If you've been putting yourself out there, the idea that you could tip into being a public person and be treated as really naked of having any recourse to civil rights, of not being defamed, of not being treated as if you're, to throw in something here, your sacred being is not sacred at all. It can be bounced around as if it was worthless. and with no deference whatsoever. And
Well, actually, Bob, if I might, I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's not because the individual is perceived as being worth less. I think if anything, you find that these forces, through commodifying the individual, see a monetary value to us. People are making money off this information, off this data, off this surveillance. We're not getting a cut of it, but somebody is. So I would actually.
Oh, I'm sorry, Saeed.
Yeah, please, no, please go ahead.
No,
Chris.
the one other thing I would add is the way that this even extends now into death when we talk about artificial intelligence. You know, I mean, I cheekily kind of refer to it as digital necromancy, right? But there are all these services now that, you know, will absorb people's social media posts and photos from when they were alive and letters that they've written and things like that, and create some sort of digital avatar or doppelganger that's supposed to be a form of communing with the person after they've died.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
tell my students, Chris, I tell my students every semester, I said, your generation is actually going to reach immortality. You will never, ever die because everything you have is now archived in the cloud, and it is all accessible for downloading. Think about that. And I don't say it necessarily to create a sense of hysteria or paranoia. And I don't know if it's a good sign that is met by more ambivalence than any other emotion. But I think it's something that people do have to contend with. That what is it? You know, before they used to say, you know, what's in your wallet? The ad. But here you have what's in your cloud.
yeah, and now I'm forced to ask, is death not even sacred at this point?
Right.
yes, you would have to leave somehow in a will that couldn't be violated, the fact that you wanted to be left alone after death. Isn't that
Yeah.
amazing? So it brings me around. I mean, this could take us right into a future discussion about AI in general and its dangers. And I'm starting to line up like a train, a bunch of cars of ideas that I want to start to talk about. But I'm going to instead, since we had said that we would have a bit of a limitation on our timing here because it's obvious that we could go on for a lot longer. I want to bring it around to that question that we started with, though, is surveillance going to be stealing what is sacred from us? And that means that it's stealing it from all of the religious ideas that we have. Some we would call good religion and some we might call bad religion, but it's taking all of those and putting them all at risk. And I'm wondering, as we conclude here, if we could talk a little bit about why this should become more important to religious groups, because what we've said here so far, I think many people might say, well, that's just several professors, what was it recently? They talk about the faculty lounge discussion, right? Too heady for the average person. But I think we've got to bring this down to earth, that people care about their spirituality. They care about, they care to say that they're spiritual but not religious. And those of us who say that we are religious, we care to say that we are spiritual and religious. And if our sacrality is going to be stolen from us almost in the dark of night when we're not quite aware of it, religious groups ought to get interested in what it's doing and see what can be done about it from a spiritual and religious point of view. What are your reactions to that idea? What should we be recommending to religious groups at this point? Saeed and Chris, who has a thought?
Chris, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, what I often point to, and this mirrors a ton of what we've talked about in the conversation, but you know, I mean, Saeed referenced this. There's been no progressive movement at all in the history of this country that hasn't been, there haven't been attempts to disrupt that through surveillance. None. I think um, that include and many of those movements have sprung from the church in one way or another. Uh, I think that often um, individuals or groups think that their particular uh, religion or their community is not under threat, uh, and that may be true at a given moment in time. But I think over the long haul, that is not true, and further, that if any community is under threat, then all communities are under threat. Um, and so I always point to the ways that, um, you know, uh, uh, that I mean, I hesitate to say this out loud, but again, like it's not because I don't think it's true, but the ways in which the government has targeted religion and religious figures throughout history, I think is, and again, powered by surveillance and thus supercharged by all the different methods of surveillance available to us now, I think is always a thing that folks should worry about if they're interested in not only their faith, but if they're interested in justice. And so it, while people may feel a certain level of comfort or not, I can't speak for any particular group, but if you do feel a certain level of comfort right now, know that there are other religious groups and traditions that don't feel that comfort, and that is, it's not always going to be just that one particular group that is threatened.
Yeah, I mean, and I think certainly after 9/11, we find that the Muslim American community had a bit of an experience with that. Certainly a chilling effect. Most mosques that I know operated off a presumption that they were being surveilled, in part because the government was telling them that they were being surveilled, also sending in informants. And so anybody who didn't seem familiar to a congregation of a particular mosque became suspect as being a potential informant. Speech definitely changed. Sermons were altered and modified to become far more docile. And when I say docile, I mean it wasn't as though they were malignant to begin with, but they became very kumbaya-esque in their tone and in their tenor. But at the same time, I have to be cautious, Bob, when you ask the question that what should religious organizations do? I wonder how many of those religious organizations can be trusted not to engage in surveillance themselves of their congregants. In some aspects, it may be for reasons that are seen as collectively beneficial. After all, if you've got a rancorous individual, that person might end up being a liability in this day and age, especially with cancel culture. That person said this, this, and this, and next thing you know, especially if you have the means to go ahead and surveil without being intrusive because people put it out there on their social media, what is your duty to then go ahead and regulate and police? In a different context, this recently happened with the son of former University of Michigan football coach legend Bo Schembechler. His son Glenn Shemmy Schembechler was hired by the university for a position which lasted 3 days. After somebody looked through his social media accounts and saw some of the material that he had either posted or retweeted that was problematic, he was let go. I see that happening with organized religions as well. And in that sense, the sacred can be impacted, which then brings us, I think, to the realization that perhaps the sacred, although associated with religious organizations or organized religion, is not a sine qua non. It's not the only option that's available. What this might do ultimately is distill our notion of the sacred to being that individual's relationship to that higher power. While there is, of course, these other conduits that are involved, like religious institutions and all, there is the recognition that even they may not necessarily be neutral within this whole issue of surveillance. They themselves may be involved, whether willingly or not, implicitly or not, and we have to be cognizant of that. I don't think at the same time that should create a disillusionment to the point where people then have a crisis of faith, or even entertain ideas of leaving faith. They might leave a particular institution, maybe they might leave a particular religion, but I don't think it then requires something as drastic as then leaving faith qua faith.
Well, I think it's sobering. Yes, go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say I'm so glad Saeed brought that up, because there have been multiple instances of churches surveilling congregants through apps, using facial recognition, or in some cases even using things like geo-tracking to out priests who they then accuse, and I use that word not as if there's something wrong from my perspective about being gay, but from those particular churches there is, but to accuse clergy of being gay. And so the churches have certainly not been above using some of these methods themselves. So I'm glad that Saeed brought that up.
Well, this is a sobering discussion, and it's hard, in fact, I think that there are some discussions that no one should attempt to leave them on a high note. The fact that we are talking about things that religious groups claim to have at a premium, as something that's of great interest to them at a premium, such as truth and justice and mercy. These are potentially being threatened by the hyper surveillance that is available in our technologies and in our communities these days. And I think that I'm happy to leave this discussion a little bit open-ended, because I think talking more about the hopes and dreams and the possible possible dangers of AI is a future discussion that this needs to lead to also. And we do intend to have a podcast where we talk about that. We had a podcast about a year or two ago. I think it was before the pandemic, because I remember we recorded it in a studio, and it was on is AI dangerous? And we were fairly sanguine about it at that point. But I think that we're on the brink of something that needs to be looked at with much more of a jaundiced eye. And I'm happy to leave it at that. Surveillance and sacrality, there is some real concern that we ought to have, and that religious groups ought to have about it in general. And so that's the thought I'm left with, and we ought to be introducing it as we are in this podcast to folks who can think about it from a theological point of view and come to some conclusions about what we ought to do as people who value their faith commitments, because this is a threat to those faith commitments, I think. Any last word from Saeed or Chris?
I'm fine to leave it open-ended until next time.
Yeah, next time we'll talk about people writing their sermons with ChatGPT. But until then, yeah, I'll leave it.
Well, I like the fact that we're leaving it with at least a smile on our faces. So thank you for that, Chris. Thank you for being willing to do this. Thank you, Professor Chris Gilliard. I thank my other friend, Professor Saeed Khan, for participating today in our podcast. It's been a very interesting conversation. I've had some new ideas come to me as we did that. If you would like to have more information on the InterFaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit, please visit our website, which is detroitinterfaithcouncil.com, or you can also send a email to faithandworkspodcast@gmail.com. We have an intro and an extra from the musicians at bensound.com, and we thank them for that. Until next time, I will look forward to further discussions. Good night.